Our final session today moves us beyond the topic of religion in the U.S. military to the subject of religiously inspired terrorism. Terrorism in the name of God. How is it that some people come to use religion in support of or as a foundation for acts of terrorism and violence? We're honored to have with us Dr. Jessica Stern, certainly one of the few people who has interviewed numerous terrorists regarding religious motivations of their acts. For 3 years, Professor Stern interviewed extremist members of 3 religions around the world, representatives from Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, finding that they had much in common in their motivations for their acts of violence. I commend to you two of her books, The Ultimate Terrorist and Terror in the Name of God. Dr. Stern earned a Master of Science degree from MIT and a doctorate in public policy from Harvard University. She is a faculty affiliate of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs and lecturer for Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. Among other appointments, she served previously as Director for Russian, Ukrainian, and Eurasian Affairs at the National Security Council, where she was responsible for national security policy toward Russia and the former Soviet states, with special regard to policies to reduce the threat of nuclear smuggling and terrorism. We welcome her today to the Newport and the Naval War College, and Dr. Stern. Thank you.
Well, I must say I don't usually imagine that my speaking about terrorism will be boring compared with the previous speaker, but I am afraid I'm not going to be able to get you quite as angry as the previous speaker. I hope I'll be able to keep you awake, if not really upset. We'll see. First, I know that a number of you have just come back from a tour, and that others of you are returning after you leave here. And I want to begin by thanking you for your service. It's really an honor for me to speak to you while you're taking this time to learn and recover, I hope. And so thank you for allowing me to be here to speak to you. Professor Cook asked me to address several questions. Are terrorists motivated by religious or ethical principles? That was one question. Another is, are they crazy? And I take from this the question, who becomes a terrorist and why? And so I'm going to try to address those 3 questions and also end with the implications for counterterrorism. But before I try to answer these questions, I want to tell you a little bit about how I've gathered the information that I'm going to present to you. By now I've been speaking less frequently since 9/11, but I have now been speaking to Terrace for at least a decade. And I had no training for doing this. I actually studied initially chemistry and then went to studied in the School of Engineering at MIT and did a doctorate in public policy where nobody teaches you how to talk to anybody. I mean, that's the last thing you learn in these kind of programs, and as a matter of fact, working on a topic that political scientists tend to think that if you talk to someone that's unserious, if you talk to your subject matter, that's journalistic, or that's for anthropologists. But I decided that I became very curious about why terrorists would say they do what they do. It doesn't mean they're going to actually tell us why they do what they do, but I think it's important for us to ask them. And the first time I wanted to talk to a terrorist, talk to one in detail, it was someone who had been involved in a group that had claimed they were going to use a chemical agent. So it came out of my work on WMD terrorism. And I was really shocked because this guy seemed to be deeply devout. He was part of an identity Christian group. I mean, he really when I sat with him, I felt that I was in the presence of a profoundly religious man, and it was very confusing to me. He just sort of had that energy, and yet he had been incarcerated, but was at that point out of jail. He had been a member of a group that wanted to rid the world of mixed-race couples and mud people. He was also quite anti-Semitic. I'm Jewish. I went to visit him in Texas. I was so intrigued and confused, and that from there I went to Pakistan and Indonesia and Palestine and Lebanon and Israel and Jordan. And since 9/11, I have not felt that I could go back to Pakistan, although the jihadi groups that I interviewed in Pakistan invited me to come for a book party, believe it or not. I'm not just afraid of the jihadis now that I've written about them. I'm also afraid of the ISI. The different parts of the Pakistani intelligence apparatus, not just the ISI, the military intelligence, had different views about the work I was doing. Obviously, somebody high up wanted me to do it. Given the human subjects requirements that I not harm the subject, Harvard initially wanted me to show that I was going to protect my data from international intelligence agencies, but I was eventually able to persuade them that I was not going to win if I tried to pull a fast one on them. That I was only going to be able to do what they wanted me to do. If we tried to lock things up, that wasn't going to work. They were going to get the information in some other way. And I still was able to do the work. Despite that, since 9/11, I've spent quite a bit of time talking to Moroccan kids in the Netherlands after the murder of Theo van Gogh. The Dutch government actually invited me at different levels. I was invited a number of times, and I got to talk to kids quite a bit. And I've also been involved in programs to help, quote, rehabilitate terrorists. And this is a very controversial topic. I know that some of you maybe saw an article I wrote in Foreign Affairs. I hear some skeptical reactions on blogs about this. I want to be clear that I am not advocating rehabilitating terrorists who are presently incarcerated, serving sentences. I don't think that we can persuade professional terrorists to give up what they're doing. I was describing a program underway in Saudi Arabia for terrorists who have completed their sentences and will return to society. And we have to make the decision. If we know that a terrorist or a suspected terrorist must be released, either because the evidence that we have against him cannot be used in court, or because he's completed his sentence, do we just put him back on the street, or do we think about how we can reduce the risks that he will return to violence? And in addition, there are programs in the United Kingdom and the Netherlands especially that try to prevent individuals from being recruited into terrorist organizations, individuals who might otherwise be joining gangs in neighborhoods where there are kids who are judged to be susceptible to recruitment to violent anti-social groups. And some of these programs are similar to the programs that actually have worked in Los Angeles for preventing recruitment to gangs. This kind of study obviously is not scientific. I did not conduct a random sample. I only talked to terrorists that I thought weren't going to kill me. How I determined that, first of all, I talked to male chauvinist terrorists. Terrorists who would think that I was less likely to be there to kill them, and also who would be more likely to think that I was stupid. That was a real advantage for me. So I did not talk, for example, to the IRA. When I talked to terrorists who might be able easily to find me, it had to be clear that they weren't going to target me. So that's not a scientific way to do this kind of study. But at the same time, it's almost impossible to do a large and statistically sound study that actually asks terrorists why they do what they do. There are a lot of large end studies now that attempt or purport to identify factors that we can see among those who join terrorist organizations, but none of those studies, as far as I know, are based on actual questionnaires, with the exception of the work now underway in Saudi Arabia, where about 4,000 terrorists have gone through a de-radicalization program that involves individual questioning and counseling. So this is a very important source of data. I tried to go down to Guantanamo and conduct interviews, and I wasn't able to do it. We're stuck with the kind of hypotheses that I'm going to put forward for you. So far, they can't be tested, have not been tested on random samples of terrorists, although some of them have been tested in larger populations. It's true that I've interviewed terrorists across religions, and I haven't written about them, but I've also interviewed Hindu extremists. There are Hindu terrorists. There are Buddhist terrorists. They come in every religion. I haven't written about them, but I want to be clear, they come in every religion. The only religion that is producing a large number of terrorists today is Islam. I'm going to say something about why I think that is. And I'm mainly going to focus on Islamist extremist terrorists today, but I want to be clear that doesn't mean that they're the only ones that exist. They're the ones that threaten us, that threaten international security more than any other group, and therefore are of most interest to this audience. So, are terrorists crazy? The first question. There's a literature that tries to address this question. Psychologists have participated in the terrorism studies literature, and I would say that they're kind of jumping over each other, trying to prove that they can show that terrorists are not crazy, that there's no pathology. And they draw these conclusions based in part on the kind of data I was mentioning, data that are made available, collected by governments, but again, generally not from interviewing terrorists. But the vast majority of studies that answer this question, are terrorists crazy, is actually based on questionnaires of former terrorists in the West. And they're not Islamist terrorists. They are mostly left-wing extremists, terrorists, from Italy and Germany. And I'm not sure that we can draw that they're exactly analogous to the terrorists we're talking about today, number one. Number two, I think that once a person gets involved in terrorism for any length of time, that is deliberately targeting non-combatants, deliberately doing what mainstream interpretations of every religion say is forbidden, deliberately targeting groups that, Mom says it's forbidden. It doesn't pass the Mom test. They're doing something they've been taught is a moral violation. It's a violation of the just war tradition, the Islamic just war tradition. It's a violation of the Judeo-Christian just war tradition. It is a violation of the laws of war. And it's also something very hard to do. It turns out it's hard for people to shoot, stab at close range. I have a hard time believing that the people who do that for a long time don't develop some kind of emotional problem. That's point one. Point two is that if you actually sit down with some of the young people who join jihadi groups, you feel something. There's a kind of a scary adrenaline that it doesn't feel like, I can't judge whether it's a pathology, but it doesn't feel the way I feel talking to you. And I think there is something about the life of crime, of a moral violation, of murder, of repeated murder of non-combatants that may do something. Now, I'm just putting this out as a hypothesis. I have no evidence other than sensation, and I just want to say I don't think we've answered the question yet. Are they motivated by religious ideology? Most terrorist organizations that I know of start out with the aim of righting a perceived injustice. And so those organizations that claim to be killing in the name of God, the perceived injustice is related to religion in some way. They may claim that they're protecting Muslims and that they are serving God as a result of their desire to protect Muslims. They may claim, as identity Christians sometimes do, that they are going to influence the timing of the return of the Messiah. So there is this feeling of doing right. In fact, often a feeling of being saint-like in the willingness to act on behalf of a group that requires assistance. But when we are able to look at the religiosity of terrorists that are detained, it turns out that religiosity or religious training is not a requirement for Islamist extremist terrorists. Indeed, religious ignorance may in fact make for a better recruit. The vast majority of terrorists detained in Saudi Arabia who go through the reintegration program, where there is extensive questioning, as I said, are actually quite ignorant about Islam. In Europe, the second and third generation kids who get recruited or self-recruited more often into the Al-Qaeda movement are rebelling against the kind of Islam, a soft version of Islam, that is practiced by their parents. And actually we saw this in Canada as well, can be a reflection of a generation gap. The Takfiri ideology, the idea that that it is serving God if you go after Muslims who are insufficiently devout. The idea of jihad as in holy war can be, it's cool. It's cool in certain communities. These youth are finding what they consider to be teachings on the internet, but ignorance helps. This is what the Saudi government is finding. It's also what the Dutch IFID, the intelligence agency there, has found about the recruits in the Hofstad group. So what do terrorists say? What do members of the Al-Qaeda movement say about what they're doing? Well, obviously, you hear them talk about how they're acting on behalf of Muslims. But the majority of victims of the Al-Qaeda movement are, in fact, Muslim. And I would argue that there really is no consensus about what the Al-Qaeda movement is about, even from the very beginning. If we look only at core Al-Qaeda, we can differentiate between core Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda affiliates like Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula that we've been hearing so much about, based in Yemen, or Jamaat Islamiyah in Singapore, Indonesia. Even if we look at the core group, the original group, the 5 leaders who became leaders of Al-Qaeda when they were fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan could not agree about what their goals were. They came up with 5 different answers to a question: what are we about? The Combating Terrorism Center found at West Point that of 516 detainees at Guantanamo, that knowing an Al-Qaeda member was more important than believing in jihad, in explaining why people ended up in Guantanamo. Do these groups, so religion has a complicated role, is the bottom line. Terrace look for passages that would seem to support the violence they want to carry out. And if you look in religious texts, and if you look carefully enough, you will find passages that seem to promote deliberately targeting a particular group of non-combatants, but it often takes a very careful reading, let's put it that way. So, is religious terrorism actually motivated by religion? It's unclear, and I'm going to say more about what I think the motivations are. What about some other factors that might be important or that have been put out as important? Do terrorists look for poor people? Are poor people more susceptible? If they're not religiously trained, are they poor? Well, that really depends. It turns out that economists have tried to look for a correlation between low GDP and terrorism, and this includes Alberto Abadi at the Kennedy School of Government and Alan Kruger, who's at Princeton and is now doing a lot of work trying to help our government improve the terrorism data that it collects and puts out. Turns out no correlation between low GDP and terrorism, as I said. But if we look at who is at the lower levels within a country, say a poor country, who ends up getting recruited within a poor country, then it becomes clear that it could be, poverty could play a role. Of the 25,000 terrorists and insurgents that were picked up in Iraq by U.S. troops and who were detained at Camp Bucca, actually at 3 camps there, 78% were unemployed, according to General Stone, and all of them were unemployed. In Saudi Arabia, 3% of those who have been detained and were put into this de-radicalization program, 3% came from higher income families. The rest came from lower and lower middle class families. So the terrorists that we're reading about today, who make the headlines, their leaders, yes, they may be from wealthy families, but that doesn't mean that is necessarily the case, nor is it the case that poverty is enough by any means. Do they look for uneducated people? Economists, again, have looked for, is there any correlation between lack of education and terrorism? That was kind of a myth that was bandied about in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. No correlation they found. However, they neglected to ask about the curriculum. In fact, it looks as though more education is in fact correlated with terrorism, but nobody's looked at what is being taught. We shouldn't be surprised that education is correlated with terrorism. Let's say neo-Nazis were advocating attacks in a school system, that they were part of the curriculum. We shouldn't be surprised if education was in fact correlated with terrorism. Again, touching on this question of religion, social dynamics seem to be critically important. Youth sometimes get drawn into these groups through their friends, as I mentioned, the 516 detainees that were assessed at Guantanamo. And some jihadi leaders are now using what is known as jihad rap in recruitment videos. Jihad rap that would seem to be counter to the kind of Islam that is being promoted by the al-Qaeda movement. And kids, we know, are sometimes attracted to extremist group through music. This is true for neo-Nazi groups, and it is now also true for for example, Al-Shabaab, in a recruitment video for Al-Shabaab. Is democracy a bulwark against terrorism? Here again, I want to rely on the work of economists. Democracy is not a bulwark against terrorism, and indeed, if we imagine that we're going to solve the problem by spreading democracy, that's not true at all. In fact, the most fraught period is democratization. That's when we see an increase in terrorism, perhaps because of chaos, which I will return to. So, terrorists are not necessarily looking for extremely religious recruits. They're not necessarily looking for poor people, especially when it comes to leaders. They're not necessarily looking for uneducated people. They definitely are using social networks, and democracy isn't going to solve the problem. What do terrorists want? What is it that these groups want to do in the world? As I mentioned earlier, they say they want to improve, to change the world, to improve social justice in one way or another. Often, certainly when it comes to terrorists that claim to be killing in the name of God, related to religion in some way. But if we look at Al-Qaeda's ideology, we begin to be skeptical, I think. And I would like to make you skeptical consumers of what terrorists say they're about what their real goal is. First, the aim was for the group that became Al-Qaeda to force the Soviets out of Afghanistan, then US troops out of Saudi Arabia, then initiate an economic crisis in America. To impress potential recruits, people follow a strong horse, therefore an attack is actually theater for potential recruits. To draw attention to the plight of Muslims. It's important to remember that fighting on behalf of Palestinians was added very late to the list of causes that the Al-Qaeda movement was promoting. To establish a caliphate, that would seem to be a deeply religious agenda, although also political. If we look at strategy manuals, not at what Al-Qaeda says it's about to the public as a marketing strategy, but what it says in its strategy manuals, one of the goals was to get the United States to attack a Muslim-majority country, which is very interesting. But publicly, the goal is to force US troops out of Iraq, to influence elections. Lately, the goals have been broader, to lift oppression of all mankind. Recently, this week, bin Laden allegedly was claiming that the goal was to fight global warming. Now, this is a guy who really is very good at marketing. I mean, need I say any more than that? I mean, we just go through this list of goals. So some of my colleagues claim that Al-Qaeda really is a political organization with a political agenda. But I would like to ask, does the group really aim to achieve these purported goals? If you actually listen to what individual terrorists say about why they join jihadi groups and why they stay in the group, you will hear not just these grand political or religious goals, but also more personal reasons. Money can be, terrorism can be a job. And in fact, when in one of the few cases that I know of where individuals have been interviewed in Iraq, not all of the individuals in detention, but it turns out that quite a few of the youth, actually, who end up in detention in U.S. facilities were paid, I don't know what percentage, but they were paid to put these IEDs in place. I imagine some of you know all about this and may even know that they're doing it for money, not out of passion or certainly not out of religion. Can we call this the spiritual reward of martyrdom related to the virgins. Is that a religious goal or is it a sexual goal? I'm not sure, but it's certainly a personal goal, I think. And we know that some youth actually believe this and are quite motivated by this reward. What this comes down to, I think, is that when we look at what terrorists say about why they do what they do, we have to consider the possibility that their goals are not just instrumental. They're partly expressive. They're not just trying to change the world, they're also trying to communicate with the world. But even more important, in my view, is that these organizations cater to the members of the organization. In other words, they're not just focused on what happens outside the group. Like many other organizations, they are focused on the needs of the members of the group or the organization. And this is consistent with what's known as the natural systems paradigm, where we look at an organization and we say, yes, the purpose is to produce cars, but another purpose is to serve the interests of the people who work in the organization. I think it's very important that we learn to look at terrorist organizations in that way, because it's important for counterterrorism. So politics, yes, part of why they do what they do. Protecting Muslims, absolutely, yes. Feeling of humiliation, that comes up if you ask terrorists why they do what they do. That they are, this may, by now it's, I think, less shocking, but the word humiliation came up in almost every one of my interviews with jihadis. And the idea of seeking an identity with dignity. The work is glamorous, that's pretty personal. The financial rewards that I mentioned. So I think that we need to recognize that this ideology, religious or otherwise, is often our marketing ploy. The most successful terrorist organizations have the most flexible ideologies. And they survive longer when the ideology is flexible and they're able to recruit money and operatives among different communities. When we see that ideology for a successful terrorist organization is in fact endogenous and flexible, we can recognize that we're in a public relations war with the enemy. What does it mean for those of us who aim to fight terrorism? Well, first of all, I think it means that this is a battle of narratives as much as anything else. The claim that our aim is to destroy the Islamic world is something that we need to fight against. And it's for this reason that Abu Ghraib, I think, was so problematic. And even Guantanamo has become really problematic because it's such an important symbol. I think the counterinsurgency manual really distills much of the way that I've been thinking about terrorism in a way that makes sense to you. And I think this kind of argument might sound outlandish, or certainly maybe did sound outlandish when I was first presenting it, but it's really not that different from what you can now read in the counterinsurgency manual. Also, in addition to our competing for this PR competition, which I think often they do better at than we do, we need to recognize that they're competing among themselves, and that internal competition among different groups who are competing for money, attention, and recruits can explain some otherwise unexplainable behavior. And also, it may be exploitable. Where are they looking for recruits? I think they're looking for recruits in areas of chaos, Somalia, Yemen, bad neighborhoods in the West. That's very problematic for us because of the ease with which Westerners, bad neighborhoods, not to be confused with bad apples, bad neighborhoods where kids are getting involved in criminal activity, where they face a lot of prejudice, and where gangs are successful at recruiting, where leaders can capitalize on this feeling of humiliation and alienation. I think this way of looking at terrorism, first of all, it suggests that a counterinsurgency approach is an important component of how we need to address the problem. Also, terrorism prevention programs that look pretty much like anti-gang programs, I think are going to be increasingly important for us to think about. For example, in Minnesota, where Somali refugees have been, in small numbers so far, recruited by al-Shabaab, very small numbers, but really a serious problem for us because of the American passport. Public diplomacy and thinking about how, for those who are doing it for the money, how we might be able to nudge them over, perhaps with finances, perhaps with career training and so on. These are important things to consider. I'll stop there and take your questions. Well, it's a very good question. I mean, I think it's understandably quite offensive to Muslims that we think of this as a Muslim problem. At the same time, no other religion is producing these many criminals claiming to kill in the name of God. No other, I mean, it's hard to get it right. This is not, we're not fighting Islam by any means, and many mainstream Muslims do not recognize the kind of Islam promoted by these groups as Muslim at all. They don't consider it to be consistent with their understanding. But we, at the same time, it is really hard to get it right. I don't have an answer for you. I don't have a new name. Is it? Have I come up with a solution to how we replace global war on terrorism? I haven't, sadly. Maybe you all, in the year you spent here, one of you will come up with an idea. Yeah, I found it surprising. Well, it's alarming. I guess I would say I find it alarming, even though this is what I do for a living. I think that what we need to do is bear in mind. I don't think he's talking about a 9/11 kind of attack. I think if you look at the strategy manuals, which I commend to you the work of the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point, where these manuals are available. They've been translated and are available actually on the website. I hope you're not offended that I refer to the Army in this way, but they really are doing very good work. You'll see that the Al-Qaeda organization was quite opposed to the kind of small-scale attacks that we've seen in Europe against America. But, gosh, I guess it was a couple months ago in Sudbury, Massachusetts, near where I live, there was a guy who wanted to carry out the kind of attack that I think the FBI has been very concerned about at a shopping mall. That's the kind of attack that Al-Qaeda did not want to carry out, but now that we're seeing the spread of this movement beyond affiliates into individuals and groups that are inspired by al-Qaeda, who are making their own rules, I think that we will see something like that. That kind of relatively low-level attack is very, very hard to defend against. And it can have profound economic and psychological effects. I think that we probably have to learn to live with a different kind of level of risk, and we cannot prevent 100% of terrorist strikes. I mean, it just is not possible. I think he's being on. I was surprised by the certain. I mean, how can you be certain of anything? But I think that it is indeed likely that we will see an attack that, like the Christmas attack that didn't work. It's likely we will see something like that. I would never say certain. Maybe he knows. Is it based on a gut feeling? Is it based on, if it were perfect intelligence, it wouldn't happen? So, I don't know why he said that. I doubt that it's about budgetary priorities, however. I'm not that cynical. Yes?
I'm a foundation member. We don't seem to hear the Muslim clerics or leaders condemning these terrorists.
Well, actually, we do. One of the really, first of all, we do in Saudi Arabia. The Saudi clerics have become much more active, and indeed, they're active on the internet. When individuals are seen, they're doing something there that we would have a hard time doing, any other government would have a hard time doing. When individuals are seen to be active on jihadi chat rooms, clerics will respond and explain that this is a misinterpretation of Islam, of Wahhabi Islam. There have been quite a few clerics, even clerics who earlier supported al-Qaeda, who have turned against the organization, in part because the organization has been so lethal to Muslims. So we do see that. Maybe we don't see enough of it, and if we don't see enough of it, it may be because, and that's just one instance of the way that I think they are sometimes more effective at spreading their message than the anti-terrorists are. Yes?
I have a sort of double question. How much do you think has the biography of Muhammad himself influenced the terrorist? We are told that Islam is not Mohammedanism. The way it is practiced by these jihadists, it is very definitely, it seems to me, Mohammedanism. Because when Muhammad fled from Mecca, 400 miles north to Medina, he achieved military supremacy. In the end, he conquered most of the Arab Peninsula. And with that, I think he set an example. Now then there's something else, and I'll probably read this haltingly because I have bad eyes. But it has to do with a report by Thomas Jefferson in 1786 to the Continental Congress. And he is quoting here somebody named Sidi Haji Abdul Aman Aja concerning preying on Christian ships. He was the ambassador to England from North Africa. That it is founded on the laws of their prophet, that it is written in their Quran that all nations who should not have acknowledged their authority were sinners, that it is their right and duty to make war upon them wherever they could be found, slain in battle is sure to go to paradise. That is, so how old this problem is what I'm trying to express. And I had not heard that kind of consideration in your discourse.
Yeah. So I think the question is really, is Islam the problem? Is Islam an inherently violent religion? I am not a scholar of religion. I'm somebody who looks at terrorism. I will predict for you that 20 years from now, we are not going to be talking about Muslim terrorists. We're going to be talking about some, I can't tell you what kind, maybe it'll be environmental. So, I mean, that's the first thing. Terrorism runs in fads and waves. This happens to be a faddish way to take down the man, so to speak. Today, there'll be another faddish way to take down the establishment in the future. But the other thing is, all religions contain the seeds of violence and indeed evil. Religion can be used for good or for evil. And I think it's important to remember the Crusades when we start thinking about what's happening in the Islamic world today. Obviously, Islamic civilization has fallen way behind. That is true economically, politically, intellectually. And some terrorist leaders describe that situation as somebody else's fault. It is humiliating in the eyes of terrorist leaders, and they try to spread the notion that that is a humiliating situation and that somebody else is to blame. Only these groups, as I said, the big problem for us today, if we look at religious terrorism, is obviously Muslim extremist terrorism, but I don't think that Islam is the problem. Jihad, you've all heard this by now, is really the greater jihad is really about helping people. It's about purifying the self. It's about helping a little old lady across the street. That's a jihad. And the jihadi groups that we talk about, that jihad is a distortion according to many mainstream readings. So I don't agree with you that Islam is the problem. I can also tell you that when I've talked to religious terrorists from other religions, they'll give me passages that would seem to support killing, deliberately targeting non-combatants of other faiths. And so I just don't agree with that position. I hear it all the time. As a person who looks at terrorism historically, it seems ridiculous to me because, forgive me, but because I know that almost any ideology can be misused by people who aim to do harm.
I think I need to answer that one, perhaps. You have mentioned the Crusades. Have you ever looked in a historical atlas at what is called the Golden Age of Islam? Compared to the magnitude of those campaigns, the Crusades are a stroll in the park.
Did you want to say something?
Yes, I could say something about the spread of Islam is a much more complicated story than military conquest, so I'd certainly say that about that, despite the rapidity of it. But a theme that you and I have talked about previously, just between us, is this theme of humiliation and trying to understand the feelings of humiliation that drive this. And I think there's a macro level and a micro level of the humiliation theme. I mean, from the long historical point of view, I think Muslims feel that they have historically been the superior civilization, and that Christendom is a sort of Johnny-come-lately rival that in the way they keep time is only a few centuries. And so there's a sense that the once great is not appreciated, not understood. The great contributions of Muslim intellectuals to the development of world culture are not appreciated, and so forth. But we've also talked about the sense of the humiliation of individuals as a recruiting theme, and you and I in particular have talked and speculated about sexual humiliation as a piece of this for some folks. I wondered if you could just say a little more for this audience, because one of the goals of this lesson was to try to get inside the heads of folks that we don't necessarily understand, and I think your thoughts about that are quite interesting and profound.
Okay, well, beginning in, I guess in the late 90s, when I started spending a lot of time in Pakistan, I was really surprised by what I read in the Pakistani media about madrasas. As you know, there's a debate certainly in the American literature on terrorism and counterterrorism, how important extremist madrasas are in promulgating an extreme ideology and actually providing cannon fodder for jihadi groups. I believe that they do play this role, but what others of my colleagues don't believe that it's important, and they bring all kinds of data that claim to show that they're right and I'm wrong. But you can often show whatever you want to show with data. I'm not talking about a global problem. I'm talking about a problem within Pakistan and Afghanistan. That's the part of the madrasa problem that I'm able to speak about. But what surprised me was that there's no discussion about, or there was no discussion about that in the Pakistani media. The discussion was about madrasas, extremist or otherwise, as a source of sexual abuse. And it's all over the media. It's hard to understand why it is that this kind of sexual abuse on the part of clergy hasn't been addressed by the government or even by why hasn't the airing of it in the media resulted in its cessation, as I think the Boston Globe took on clergy sexual abuse in the Boston area. More and more is coming out about clergy sexual abuse all over the world, and yet this trend that we see in Pakistan, it doesn't seem to, it hasn't really been addressed as far as I can tell. And the question arises, to what extent does that play a role in the kind of humiliation that would lead a person to be susceptible to recruitment? Yes, there is this issue of civilizational humiliation, that if you read the writings of Zawahiri, you'll see that he himself talks about civilizational humiliation, that the best way for the youth of Islam to overcome that civilizational humiliation is to pick up a gun and join what he refers to as a jihad. But there's another element of individual humiliation, and it's something that I often heard about on the part of identity Christians, and sometimes it even seemed to be have a kind of sexual element, and so I was quite intrigued to learn about the rape of boys in Afghanistan on Thursday nights, which some of you may know about. And I've been anxious to find someone who would be willing to be quoted on this topic, and thank you very much for finding me someone. who would be. I don't know to what extent sexual humiliation is a major, if could we do a study where we could ask recruits, were you sexually humiliated in some way? Were you abused by a cleric or someone else? Just to give you one example, the cleric who claims responsibility for creating the Taliban is known as Maulana Sandwich because he liked to have a boy on one side and a girl on the other side. It's something that people just talk about there, and yet we don't hear about it here. And certainly, if we think about, I'm intrigued in terms of how you think about preventing recruitment or how you think about reintegrating individuals who must be returned to society at the end of a prison sentence. Do we need to address post-traumatic stress disorder? Could post-traumatic stress disorder result from the war that these often young men think they've been involved in? Or could it also result from earlier sexual abuse? It's something I wanted to put out there. I finally had the courage to do it. And I'll plant this seed in your mind as something to think about. I don't know whether we would find, if somebody were able to do this study, that pederasty is one of the reasons why, the practice of pederasty is one of the reasons why we can find why extremists have been more successful among Muslims than they have been among other religions at this point. I don't know, but I just put it out there as a possibility. There, have I? Yes.
You indicated that you weren't all that well familiar with the history of Islam. And just for the record, the Judeo-Christian experience goes back to 4,000 years before Christ, and another 2,000 forward. Islam didn't come into existence until 610 AD. And after 610, Muhammad died in 632, and they attacked Jerusalem in 637, and over the next 200 years they built the Dome of the Rock on top of King David's palace. In the 80 years after that, they went into Spain, and they completely took over Spain until Queen Isabella kicked them out in 1492. They advanced as far as Vienna in 1683, and then they were repulsed back into the Ottoman Empire. It's interesting to note that the reason that Christopher Columbus discovered the Western world was because Europe was cut off from trade via the silk trade and the fertile trade through Iraq, because the Muslims controlled that territory and that sea. They either charged a tax or captured the trade from Europe going to the east. So Queen Isabella found this fellow named Christopher Columbus and says, well, the world's round, I can go to the west. And so Islam is responsible for the discovery of the New World because Christopher went west and he found the New World and settled in the islands just south of Florida. So this has been ongoing for a long time. This is fully documented by historian Bat Yor, B-E'-O-R, and the Crusades were not instigated by the Europeans, they were a pushback. Between 1090 and 1290 AD, after multiple raids into Europe and capturing European slaves and taking them back to Muslim countries, the princes of Europe were forced by their populations to do something about it, and they launched a series of crusades trying to regain Jerusalem. They did so for a period of about 80 years, but subsequently lost it. But it wasn't restored until 1948 under the UN treaty. So there's some history there. The Jihad process has been going on for a long time. If you can find a single verse in the Quran that talks against jihad, please let me know. Otherwise, take a look at verse 9, 111, which was quoted by the terrorist that went into our trade center, and dozens of other similar passages that authorize that kind of activity. But I would welcome anyone in this room who could provide a single verse out of the Quran that would speak otherwise. Thank you.
I guess I would just ask you, first of all, I think that's a somewhat idiosyncratic interpretation, but with a particular agenda. But beyond that, what's the solution? If you're right, what's the solution?
As you've indicated, it is a mind game. We do have to break the code of what would appeal to them, but certainly it is not weakness. It's one thing that the Muslims respect more than anything else is strength. And every time we back off, they fill up the vacuum. So we can't be sitting here cutting back our defenses and retreating from those areas of the world. We need to find the psychological code. There's a degree of political correctness in everything that we are doing here. We noticed with Major Hassan, we're not allowed to refer to him as a Muslim extremist or any way associated with Islam. He's just a common criminal, when in fact he had the same imam who practiced in Virginia, and the same imam out of Yemen who helped with the Christmas Day bomber on this last year. Both of them were Muslim jihad-oriented kind of events. When Hassan murdered the 14 people, and politically correctness, we're not allowed to say 14, we have to say 13 in deference to the people that don't believe that a baby is a person. So political correctness is truncating our discussions here and everywhere else. And we're not going to come to the answer until we can talk truthfully to one another in an open debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Stern, for your comments.